Welcome to this episode of the weekly News Roundup. Israeli forces pressed their assault on the Gazan border town of Rafah, once seen as the territory's last refuge. Despite an order last week from the top UN court to halt its operation there, at least 45 people, including children, were killed at the refugee camp in Gaza's Rafah after an Israeli airstrike. The incident coming just days after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to halt its operation in Rafah triggered international outrage, deepening the global isolation facing Israel over the war in Gaza. Israel launched the attack on Rafah late Sunday, hours after Hamas unleashed a barrage of rockets at the Tel Aviv area, most of which were intercepted. Rafah was a major entry point for humanitarian aid before Israel stepped up its military offensive on the Gaza side of the border earlier this month and seized control of the crossing. Fighting in Rafah has caused more than 1 million Palestinians to flee, most of whom had already been displaced in the war between Israel and Hamas. Palestinians say they are vulnerable to Israeli attacks wherever they go and have been moving up and down the Gaza Strip in the past few months. When Israeli forces told those in the north to evacuate before conducting operations in central Gaza and the southern city of Khan Yunus, hundreds of thousands had fled south to Rafah. The health ministry in Gaza said in a statement that Israeli shelling in and around health facilities in Rafah has left just one health facility still operational. Humanitarian groups warn of a spiraling crisis in Gaza after the fighting in Rafah cut off the main aid routes into the territory. The Rafah offensive stirred renewed outrage and prompted an outcry from global leaders. Israel, however, vowed to press on with the Rafah strike despite the global condemnation and a US warning. We bring you this report.
The Israeli military has denied striking a tent camp west of Rafah on Tuesday after Gaza health authorities said Israeli tank shelling had killed at least 21 people there in an area Israel has designated a civilian evacuation zone. Earlier, defying an appeal from the International Court of Justice, Israeli tanks advanced to the heart of Rafah for the first time after a night of heavy bombardment. The United States, Israel's closest ally, reiterated its opposition to a major Israeli ground offensive in Rafah but said it did not believe such an operation was underway. Describing the US view of what would constitute a major offensive in Rafah, White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby told reporters that it would involve large numbers of troops in columns and formations in some sort of coordinated maneuver against multiple targets on the ground. 2 days after an Israeli airstrike on another camp stirred global condemnation, Gaza Emergency Services said 4 tank shells on Tuesday hit a cluster of tents in Al-Mawasi, a coastal strip Israel designated as an expanded humanitarian zone where it advised civilians in Rafah to go for safety. At least 12 of the dead on Tuesday were women, according to medical officials in the Hamas militant-run Palestinian enclave. But Israel's military later said in a statement that, contrary to the reports from the last few hours, the Israel Defense Forces did not strike in the humanitarian area in Al-Mawasi. International unease over Israel's 3-week-old Rafah offensive has turned to outrage after an attack on Sunday set off a blaze in a tent camp in a western district of the city, killing at least 45 people. Global leaders expressed horror at the fire in a designated humanitarian zone of Rafah where families uprooted by fighting elsewhere had sought shelter, and they urged the implementation of a world court order last week for a halt to Israel's assault. The Israeli military said it was investigating the possibility that munitions stored near a compound targeted by Sunday's airstrike may have ignited and touched off the blaze. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that a tragic mishap was made in an Israeli strike in the southern Gaza city of Rafah that set fire to a camp housing displaced Palestinians. Netanyahu, however, did not elaborate on the error. Israel's military initially said it had carried out a precise airstrike on a Hamas compound, killing 2 senior militants. As details of the strike and fire emerged, the military said it had opened an investigation into the deaths of civilians. Egypt is again trying in tandem with Qatar and the US to revive talks on a ceasefire and the release of hostages held by Hamas. But efforts have been hampered by Israel's assault on Rafah. A person familiar with the issue said that Israel delivered its latest ceasefire and hostage release proposal to Qatar, and Qatar was to provide it to Hamas on Tuesday. Hamas has said talks are pointless unless Israel ends its offensive in Rafah. More than 36,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's offensive, Gaza's health ministry says. Israel says it does its best to adhere to the laws of war. Israeli leaders also say they face an enemy that makes no such commitment, embeds itself in civilian areas, and refuses to release Israeli hostages unconditionally. Israel says it wants to root out the last major intact formations of Hamas fighters hunkered down in Rafah and rescue hostages it says are being held in the area.
From Rafah, we move to Papua New Guinea. Last weekend on Friday, a deadly landslide struck a remote village in the Enga province of Papua New Guinea. The authorities in Papua New Guinea informed the UN on Monday that more than 2,000 people were buried in the massive landslide that swept over the Yambali village in the Enga province. The country's National Disaster Center told the United Nations office in the capital Port Moresby that the landslide buried more than 2,000 people alive and caused major destruction. A once bustling remote hillside village in the Enga province was almost wiped out when a chunk of Mount Mongalo collapsed in the early hours on Friday morning, burying scores of homes and the people sleeping inside them. The landslide caused major destruction to buildings and caused a major impact on the economic lifeline of the country, the disaster office said. The main highway to Porgera mine, one of the largest gold mines in Papua New Guinea, was completely blocked, it said in the letter which was received by UN officials. The situation remains unstable as the landslip continues to shift slowly, posing ongoing danger to both the rescue teams and survivors alike. We bring you this report.
The landslide, which villagers in Papua New Guinea say struck like an exploding bomb, may have buried more than 2,000 people alive, a government agency fears. The figure provided by the acting director of the country's National Disaster Center is far higher than the 670 the United Nations suggested over the weekend. Exact casualty figures for the disaster, which tore through the Yambali village in the early hours of Friday, have been difficult to establish. Desperate attempts to rescue survivors or remove bodies from the rubble have so far been hindered by rubble, which is nearly 32 feet deep in some places, blocked access, and a lack of adequate equipment. But on the ground, hopes are fading for the mountain residents swept up in the disaster in Enga province. A school teacher from a neighboring village told news agency AFP, "Nobody escaped. We don't know who died because records are buried." Standing in the wreckage of the disaster, which extends for close to a kilometer, Evid Cambo said she felt helpless. She told the Reuters news agency,
I think family plumi or staro ground. Now some like and mino can candy and planty. So me get me power on the ground with or some now you black elvi mia me hamas lo you black. So me allo kisi more pemblo plumi stop in the ground here. Me stop here.
Lassen Iso told local newspaper The National that the landslide struck like an exploding bomb in a split second, while Eddie Peters said she watched it rush towards her home like a sea wave. She told the newspaper that her husband had turned back as their 4 children were sleeping in the house. She fled, but they were all trapped and killed. About 3,800 people had been living in the area prior to the disaster. The letter by the National Disaster Center said the damage was extensive. While the government estimates over 2,000 people may be buried under the debris, only 6 bodies have been recovered so far. It called on the UN to inform Papua New Guinea's development partners and other international friends of the latest situation. Authorities fear a second landslide and disease outbreak are looming at the scene of Papua New Guinea's mass casualty disaster because of water streams and bodies trapped beneath the tons of debris that swept over the village. A United Nations official said. A mass of boulders, earth and splintered trees devastated Yambali in the South Pacific nation's remote highlands when a limestone mountainside sheared away on Friday. The blanket of debris has become more unstable with recent rain and streams trapped between the ground and the rubble, said Serhan Aktoprak, chief of the International Organization for Migration's mission in Papua New Guinea. The UN agency has officials at the scene in Enga province helping shelter 1,600 displaced people. The agency estimates 670 villagers died, while Papua New Guinea's government has told the United Nations it thinks more than 2,000 people were buried. 5 bodies had been retrieved from the rubble by Monday. Another major concern is the movement of the land, the debris, which is causing a serious risk, and there are concerns that the overall number of people that may be affected might be more. That also includes villages whose source of clean drinking water has been buried and subsistence farmers who lost their vegetable gardens. If this debris mass is not stopped, if it continues moving, it can gain speed and further wipe out other communities and villages further down the mountain, Mr. Aktoprak said. Disturbing scenes of villagers digging with their bare hands through the muddy debris in search of their relatives' remains were also concerning. Mr. Aktoprak added, "My biggest fear at the moment is corpses are decaying. Water is flowing and this is going to pose serious health risks in relation to contagious diseases." The warning comes as geotechnical experts and heavy earth-moving equipment are expected to reach the site soon. The landslide buried a 200-meter stretch of the province's main highway. But the highway had been cleared from Yambali to the provincial capital Wabag through to Leh, officials said. Papua New Guinea is a diverse, developing nation with 800 languages and 10 million people who are mostly subsistence farmers. In latest news coming in, Papua New Guinea has moved to evacuate an estimated 7,900 people from remote villages near the site of the deadly landslide as authorities warned of further slips. With rescue and relief efforts hampered by the remote location, Enga Provincial Administrator Sandit Saka warned the disaster could yet worsen. Saka said authorities were trying to coordinate the evacuation of almost 7,900 people as clumps of limestone, dirt and rock continued to shear off Mount Mungalo. "The tragedy is still active," he said. "Every hour you can hear rock breaking. A vast smear of yellow and grey debris can be seen cutting through verdant bushland and severing the region's only road." The Papua New Guinea Defense Forces are trying to access the site with heavy earth-moving equipment.
From Papua New Guinea, we move to Myanmar, which is the erstwhile Burma, where a crisis is developing. Whenever one thinks of Myanmar, one thinks of Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and former leader of Myanmar. Ms. Suu Kyi has been detained since February 2021 when she was ousted by the military coup. In July of 2023, she was moved from prison to house arrest in the Burmese capital, but it is still unclear where in the city she is being held. For decades, ethnic groups here have fought the military leadership that has ruled the Southeast Asian nation. A transition to democracy was cut short by a military coup 3 years ago. Although Myanmar is a predominantly Buddhist country, the constitution guarantees religious freedom. However, Cardinal Charles Maung-Bo, Archbishop of Yangon in Myanmar, pointed out a worrying reality. He said, The last decade saw the emergence of fundamentalist forces that targeted minority religions. The conflict has already left more than 100 places of worship bombed or damaged, the Cardinal said, and the violence has spread in many areas of the territory. In addition, he said that almost 3 million people have been displaced and are in urgent need of assistance. The crisis in Myanmar is a never-ending nightmare for the country's people, happening far away from the international spotlight. UN Rights Chief Volker Turk told the Human Rights Council. Robbed of their first taste of democratic freedom, the young people took to the streets and joined in acts of civil disobedience. They were met with violence and arrests. Many left Yangon and other major cities for this remote jungle outpost to join the insurgency that is sweeping across the countryside. This is an underreported conflict. The military restricts press freedom and has jailed hundreds of journalists. There is no way to hear the resistance side of the story through government-approved methods. An underground railroad has been established from Myanmar's main cities for those rebelling against the military's new conscription law. It spirits them along clandestine routes through safe houses and handlers to Karenni and other resistant-held areas. We bring you this report.
There is a burning sense of betrayal among them. They grew up during Myanmar's transition to democracy, which began in 2015 after more than half a century of military rule. But the promise of freedom was snatched away with the military coup in 2021, which toppled the civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Most of the group have completed the month-long basic military training offered by the armed opposition group, the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force (KNDF), which operates here. The KNDF was established after the coup and its leadership of a disparate grouping of Karenni resistance and ethnic groups has pushed the troops of the military junta out of 90% of the state, it claims. One fighter, when asked why he was chosen to take up arms, replied that he has only two choices: to fight for the military or to join the revolutionary forces. He said, "If I fight for the army, I will be tormenting my own people and will be killing them." There are those, however, who have chosen not to fight but to dedicate themselves to the revolution in other ways. 28-year-old Dr. Yori, who came here a year ago, is one of them. He's standing near what looks like a small grey building with newly planted vegetation camouflaging its roof that actually turns out to be the entrance to an underground operating theatre. It is hidden away to stoke the planes of the military junta bombing it, he says. Men and women, many who have lost limbs, are lying on beds on a dirt floor in the recovery ward. The UN says Myanmar is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world and that injuries have soared since the coup. The war has killed tens of thousands, many of them children. The military doesn't distinguish between civilians and resistance fighters in opposition areas. It has labeled them terrorists and targeted both. Before the war and until the young revolutionaries arrived, medical facilities were in short supply in Karenni state. None of the medical staff here are local. They have come from all over the country. Yori's fiancée, Tracy, is one of them. She is in the operating theatre, finishing surgery on a man wounded in an artillery strike. The couple didn't get a chance to finish medical school. They were final year students in Yangon and vocal critics of the coup. Tracy was his student leader. The military issued arrest warrants for both her and Yori. According to some estimates, the military has lost control of between half and two-thirds of the country, as established armed resistance and ethnic groups have joined together to challenge its rule. But in many respects, it is hard to fully comprehend the strength of the resistance in Karenni. So much of it is hidden along dark forest tracks, away from view in deep jungle camps and bases. Mo Premier, a violinist who fled her home, runs the Golden Flower Music School in the jungle. Gathered around her are dozens of school children following along on their own instruments. Music is her weapon, and this is a place of safety for the children. The kids range in ages from 14 to 20. The war has disrupted so many lives, and Mo Premier explains that this is a revolutionary service keeping the children safe and distracted from the suffering around them. But the fighting can't be ignored, and when asked how she feels that some of her students may choose to live here for the front lines, she says,
"ခဏကိုလည်းပေးဆက်ရမယ်အသက်လည်းပေးဆက်ရမယ်မိသားစုကိုလည်းရှင်းနိုင်ရမယ်ခြေတွေလက်တွေကိုကောင်မလေးကိုကောင်လေးကိုထားခဲ့ပြီးတော့သူများရှေ့ထွက်တိုက်ရပါတော့ကိုချစ်တဲ့သူတွေရတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဆိုတော့သူတို့ရဲဘော်တွေကိုတော့ကျွန်မအမြဲလေးစားတယ်ဂုဏ်ယူတယ်ကျွန်မရဲ့ခံယူချက်ရောကျွန်မရဲ့စိတ်ထဲမှာရောဘလို့နေရာမျိုးဖြစ်ရဲဘော်ဆိုတဲ့နံပါတ်1ပဲဘယ်သူပဲရှိလို့ပေါ့နော်ဒါကျွန်မရဲ့ခံယူချက်ကျွန်မတို့သူတို့လေးပေးတယ်ပေါ့အသေးထားတယ်လေးနဲ့ထားတယ်ပေါ့
When asked whether she realizes that some of her students may never return from the front lines, she begins to weep. The people of Karenni state know these are wilderness years. No one expects the conflict will end anytime soon. So, they do what they can, living their undercover existence, tending the sick, caring for children, and joining the armed struggle. They have left lives and families behind, but it is a worthwhile sacrifice, they say, to build the Myanmar they were promised.
Every month, Pope Francis dedicates that month for a special intention of his and exhorts the whole world to especially pray for that intention. This month, Pope Francis urges us to pray for people fleeing from their own homelands because of war or poverty. We bring you this video from Pope Francis's worldwide prayer network.
Queridos hermanos y hermanas, quisiera que en este mes oremos por los que huyen de su país. Al drama que viven las personas forzadas a abandonar su tierra, huyendo de guerras o de la pobreza, se une muchas veces el sentimiento de desarraigo, de no saber a dónde se pertenece. Además, en algunos países de llegada, los migrantes son vistos con alarma, con miedo. Aparece entonces el fantasma de los muros en la tierra que separan a las familias y muros en el corazón. Los cristianos no podemos compartir esta mentalidad. El que acoge a un migrante acoge a Cristo. Debemos promover una cultura social y política que proteja los derechos y la dignidad del migrante y que los promueva en sus posibilidades de desarrollo y que los integre. Un migrante hay que acompañarlo, promoverlo e integrarlo. Oremos para que los migrantes que huyen de las guerras o del hambre, obligados a viajes llenos de peligro y violencia, encuentren aceptación y nuevas oportunidades en la vida.
Thanks for watching. Until we meet next time, stay blessed.